Yes, they'll talk about the new Adeptus Custodes detachment lines of the Emperor, and whether you're playing Custodes or you're playing against them, I highly recommend to watch this because you will encounter it on the tabletop, and if you're playing Custodes, you really need to know this one because it's very likely that it's the most powerful one we have access to. So without further ado, let's dive right in. So we'll talk about the strength of this particular way of playing Custodes. Usually I like to talk about the strength of the army, but considering that we are going so granular now and talking about specific detachments, this is more of a strength of the Custodes plus this particular detachment. Custodes are, if you didn't know, a hyper-elite and mostly infantry-based faction that excels in the combat phase, fight phase I should say, and has a selection of tools that are efficient in making them a shooting power as well. So they are mostly combat focused, but they have some shooting assets as well that are really powerful. New detachment that we have received is going to give us a chance to have a new go at the tried and tested, balanced, relatively balanced Custodes army approach, as I think it should be played. Some people think that you should completely uproot everything that the Custodes army is about and play a totally different style. I disagree with that, and you'll see why in a moment. We do get new tools, and we do get a chance to use some unusual units that we're not really used to. What we get from the detachment rule essentially is a +1 to hit and +1 to wound when our Custodes units are outside of 6 from any other Custodes units, excluding vehicles. So if you have a squad of Custodian Guard that are, say, shooting their Custodian spears at something, if they are within 6 of no one in your army or within 6 of a tank, for example, they are going to get +1 to hit and +1 to wound. +1 to hit doesn't really matter much except for when you're firing at stealth targets, which does sometimes happen, and it's a useful thing to have in your pocket, where +1 to wound is a game changer. It's something that will make your strength 4 AP1 damage to spear shots from being mediocre at best, even with full rerolls to wound that you get with Custodian Guard on the objective, you will make that into something that can really put the hurt onto, I don't know, say an Armiger Warglaive, especially if that Warglaive is not in cover, because AP1 is the other single most influential factor in that shooting. Low AP equals low results usually when you're firing at good armor save targets. It's safe to say this +1 to wound buff also works in combat, and it's a very easy to use buff, probably not as easy as you might think, because you might think, well, I'm gonna always have it active. No, it's not gonna be always active. Sometimes you'll just have to be relatively close to your other units, but I would say in most situations where you have planned to be outside of 6, you will be outside of 6, and having +1 to wound on something that like a Guardian Spear, which is strength 7 and already wounds most stuff on 5s or even better, it's amazing. I can tell you that because I am a big fan of Venatari, and I sometimes run the Custodes bikes, and both of them have lance on their spears, and that lance really makes a difference. It's relatively easy, as I said, to use this just because the army itself, as I said, is hyper elite, so there are not too many units, individual units, and if you're running like a 5-man squad of Wardens plus a Blade Guard champion, it's a lot of points in a single square inch of the board, but it's still just one unit technically, and that one unit is going to get that buff. Actually, recently played in an RTT tournament, and I have played a game in the last round against the Lions of the Emperor detachment, and I must say that the power of the Custodes have really surprised me, because I have been charged, my Gilman has been charged by a squad of like 1 Blade Guard champion and also 2 Wardens, and I was pretty sure that this small unit will not be able to go through my Gilliman that quickly, considering that I had Armor of Contempt available as well. And unfortunately they did, and they killed Gilman. Thankfully he woke up from his sleep afterwards by rolling a 6, but then well, still the +1 to wound really mattered there, and I saw a lot of those failed wounds, or wounds that would have failed if it was any other type of detachment. Plus, in addition to that really nice rule, and I must say that rule is probably much better than the one that we have in Shield Host, because the Shield Host rule only applies to combat, which is you crit on 5s, whether you're choosing lethals or sustained, doesn't matter, it's still crit on 5s, and it's really good, but having +1 to wound both in shooting and in combat, in shooting especially for something like Kiradrax's squad with the guard that now will also get +1 to wound. They've been an amazing shooting squad by themselves already, and now they're just that much better. +1 to wound modifier is generally speaking just better than the 5 crits, and I did do math there, and it is about like 15-20% better depending on the particular combination of units than critting on 5s, especially when you're talking about fighting against higher toughness targets than your strength. Again, we're getting a good suite of stratagems here. The most important of those strats that I was really looking forward to seeing when I realized that Custodes received a new detachment are fallback, shoot and charge, which I think is just a mandatory stratagem to have. I don't consider detachments that don't have this strat for Custodes relevant, because if you have like a 200 or 300 point unit that is just stuck there in combat for another turn, and you would want to have that unit elsewhere, it can be and often is a loss that you cannot really recover from. So that's why following back and charging and shooting is something that I positively think must have in a detachment that I play with Custodes, and the same I recommend to you. So it's a good thing we have this one, and it costs only 1 CP. All strats in this detachment cost 1 CP. Another one good one we have is reactive D6-inch move when we are shot. This one you really need to play well with, so you really need to plan for it. For example, if you have a Kiradraxis just sticking out half an inch from the side of a ruin to shoot an enemy squad, you can, if you want to, position her in this way, and then when your opponent shoots back, first volley will be able to target the unit, but then the second volley will not, because you will roll a d6, and even if it's just you roll a 1 on the d6, you're still gonna go away, and you won't be visible, especially if you roll like a higher than 1 on the roll. We also get a pretty useful fight on death on 4s and 2s for the character. So you roll the number of dice equal to the number of models your squad lost, and on 4s normal Custodes get to swing back, and on 2s the character inside the squad. It's a useful get out of jail card, insurance that your Custodes squad will be able to essentially at least take the thing that has killed them with them, or maybe partially remove it from the board. If it was like a squad of Terminators, you're probably not killing that on the swing back, considering that roughly half of your unit is going to be fighting back. But you know, Custodes, that they do really punch hard, so even if half a squad fights back, it's still a very, very high chance that the opponent's unit is going to suffer tremendous losses. We also get a stratagem that allows us to use a one-off ability from one of our characters again in the game. This is a very, very situational one, because you have to use it immediately after the character has used his ability, and this is probably what keeps it from being a more actively used stratagem, because you need to essentially predict that you will positively need that extra ability, and then you get to use it again. For example, Blade Champion's Advance and Charge only works once per game, and maybe you would want to use it again sometime down the road, but having to do it immediately means that you now must spend the CP, and then later you might want to use it, and that is not a great investment. So I still consider this stratagem to be like maybe a reserve one, not necessarily something you want to use every time. And probably most importantly, we're getting an incredible suite of enhancements here, some of the best ones in the game, I could say, and we are going to take a look at them at the end of the video in the Synergy section. As always, I want to remind you about my Patreon 40K coaching service. If you're looking for help building your competitive rosters, preparing you for tournaments, or have any questions about your collection in general, check out the links for my Patreon in the description. Thank you. Now, the weaknesses of Custodes, in addition to the weaknesses of the detachment, like these two combined. First, they're slow-ish, because they are a foot slogging army with a 6-inch move. Yes, you can have a Blade Champion that gives 1 unit once per game advance and charge. It doesn't make the army quick, it just makes 1 unit quick once in a game. you should treat this army as a slow-moving army, meaning that you need to be careful with your positioning, especially in the early game, in the deployment. You need to know where you're going to be going, where you're going to be advancing turn 1 to make sure that you actually reach that point, maybe save a command point for an important advance if you really know the difference between, say, rolling a 2 and rolling a 5 is difference between you being fully in cover and then you'll be invisible from a certain angle for your opponent. The detachment doesn't really solve that problem in any way. The only real mobility buff that we get here is the Swift as the Eagle stratagem that gives us the ability to move d6 after we are shot, which you could interpret it as an advance and charge in a weird way, because like if you have your warden squad somewhere and your opponent is not careful enough that they decide to plink a few wounds maybe off one of your wardens, then you can punish them essentially by using that stratagem and moving extra d6 inches. And if that warden squad has a blade champion inside, you could say theoretically that it's the same as having 2 advances in a turn instead of 1, but that's a very backwards way of thinking about the strat. And the detachment, it really, because of the enhancements, it really wants us, as you'll see in the composition section, wants us to use the deep striking forces like the Alaris. And the deep strike is nice, but the problem with it is that we don't have any bonuses to charge, and we still don't have them. I'm so surprised that even in this detachment, which obviously is it wants us to use Alaris, it wants us to use Terminators, and despite there being so many armies in the game, like Grey Knights, for example, who now can deep strike 6 inches away, like for Grey Knights, they've solved this problem. For Custodes, they just refuse to give us access to reliable charges, and I have personally seen this strategy fail for my opponent, where they wanted to try and rely on 9-inch charges, and despite them rolling higher on average, so they succeeded with like 4 out of 4 charges with maybe 2, which is not how stats should work, but still it did not change the situation. It was not enough at the right time. So we need to take that into account when we're building the list. Second weakness is we are highly elite. So sisters are probably the only cheap thing you have access to in the army. And yeah, they are reasonably cheap. 40 points for the Squad of Prosecutors, 50 points for the Witch Seekers. So you will be using them to control objectives for you and do actions, which is a good thing. But apart from that, everything else on the board is very expensive. So it means that you'll have only a few units to work with on the board, and whenever you lose something, you lose big. It's not like when you are running an army with a bunch of vehicles, where vehicles, until they are brought down completely, they are acting almost as if they are untouched. Yes, they suffer -1 to hit, but -1 to hit modifier is not exactly the same as losing 4 out of 5 Custodes in your unit. The Alaris are more deadly in this detachment thanks to the +1 to wound that works magically well with their full reroll to wound against vehicles, monsters, and characters, and they are technically the cheapest actual Custodes unit you can buy, with a cost of 130 points currently for 2 Alaris. So in theory, that could help set that weakness back a bit. Next is mortal wounds protection. This is a big concern I have with this detachment. This is the one thing that I was really worried about when I have read the detachment. At first I was like, oh wow, it's amazing, it's so much better than Shield Host. And then after a second, I took a step back, I looked at the stratagem with the Shield Host, and that's when it hit me. We don't have 4+ Feel No Pain, or for that matter, any Feel No Pain protection against mortal wounds in this detachment. And we really don't have any mortal wounds protection in general, because the only units that are protected are sisters, which, well, yeah, that's all good and amazing, but if we get a grenade in the face of our wardens or custodian guard or tank shock, which are both things that are very, very common in the meta now, you're not going to have any protection from that. And you can just lose like 2 Custodes, 2 full Custodian Guard, or, God forbid, Wardens, just by being hit by a 6 wound tank shock. If they're all hot on the roll, it's really easy for that to happen. That's one thing that's keeping me from saying outright that this detachment is so much better than Shield Host. I still think that it probably is better to some extent, but I'm worried about the mortal wounds, and so should you be. And lastly, with a small disadvantage of this one, but it really messes with the Venatari and the bikes because they already have lance, so they already have +1 to wound. So unless they are charged in their turn or the combat is ongoing and for some reason you cannot fall back and charge, though Venatari already have fall back and charge in build, so it would be weird for you not to be able to. I didn't imagine a condition where that would be relevant. Maybe like if you are prevented from falling back by the World Eaters, which is a bad situation to be in, but I digress. That's why Venatarian bikes are probably not the best choices for this detachment, and to be honest, it's not a big problem because we have some other things we probably want to take instead. So, army composition. How do we construct a list knowing everything that we've just discussed together? First, we have some rules from the older Custodes builds that I think apply here as well. If you want to succeed with this one, I think you should follow these several rules. First, we want n amount of sisters for scoring. N amount is really subjective because you definitely want at least one for the home objective. You probably want two because you want to have one on the home objective and one on your natural expansion objective where you would send that squad. And maybe if you are feeling like you have the points, which probably you want because of how amazing the enhancements are and the fact that you're bringing some unusual squads that usually you don't bring, I don't think you'll have the option for going there with the third sister squad, but if you do, you might want that as well, maybe putting that in strategic reserves to make sure that you have something that you can deploy closer to your opponent's lines and do another action. That's the rule number one. Rule number two is we want at least 2 Clyde tanks because they are amazing, and they're still amazing. They have not even been hit with a nerf to their cost. They're still 215 points if I remember correctly, and they are absolutely amazing. Nothing has changed. We still want to shoot vehicles, we still want to destroy tanks. Everything is the same essentially in the meta currently, so they are still more than relevant, and I don't consider a Custodes list without at least 2 of these tanks. We want at least 1 squad of wardens, in my opinion, with a blade champion, of course. It should be a max size warden squad. I don't think that it's worth going for 4-man, especially if you only have 1, because the wardens unit, it serves as the backbone, as the anvil of your army. Everything else sort of builds around that, and I think that's why, despite them being more expensive now, both the Blade Champion and the Wardens themselves, I think investing in at least 1 unit is still more than relevant. I'm gonna add, now that I look at this slide, I'm probably gonna add the rule number 4 to this as well, which is you are gonna want to have Draxes and Custodian Guard. I've added that lower, as you can see in the slide, but I think it is worth being rule number 4 because I just don't see a reason why, especially in this detachment where the shooting part of that unit is so much better, I don't understand why you wouldn't want to run them. So yeah, rule number 4 is you probably want to have Custodian Guard with Draxes. It can be a 4-man Custodian Guard, you don't have to go for a 5, especially considering that percentage-wise, the Custodian Guard, the 4-man, is now cheaper points per model than the 5-man. After that, finally, we have some options that we can go for. And the first thing that you are going to want to look at are Alarius captains, because they are really good in this detachment because of the enhancements. So we'll probably most likely want to run at least 2 of those captains with some retinue of Alars. Most likely just 2-man squads, because those guys are incredibly expensive just by themselves. And they will be rapid ingressing, not deep striking, rapid ingressing most likely, because you can technically deep strike them somewhere where like you are okay with them failing the charge. That can be a particular example, but usually you want them to make the charge, so you want to rapid ingress them somewhere where your opponent will not be able to target them, like behind the wall, and where their full 5-inch move is gonna carry them forward to make sure that they actually make that charge next turn. Technically, you're deep striking 9 inches away, so you should be good with that 5-inch move, but sometimes things happen, So like, remember your reactive moves. If your opponent reactive moves away from your Alaris, you're going to be in trouble. So keep that in mind when you're rapid ingressing, where you are rapid ingressing to in this case, and you should be fine. The package of Alaris captains, and we're not yet talking even about the enhancements, just wait a few moments and we're going to cover those as well. Just the package of Alaris captain with the 2 Alaris is amazing by itself, because the captain is going to get the full rerolls to wound from Alaris, and the whole thing is going to have +1 to wound on their attacks. The captain has his rule to make a stratagem free, so you're making that rapid ingress free if you want to, or something else. The only problem is that you cannot have multiple captains making different things, 0 CP, because it says that only one model of many that can have this ability can use it in a battle round, so you are not going to get multiple discounts. Alaris captains have the make all damage to that captain 1 damage for the entire phase. So if your Alaris are dead and the captain is the only thing that is left, it's going to be really tricky for your opponent to bring the captain down in one go. It's still possible, but it's not guaranteed, not even close. Next, bikes. So they could be pretty good in this detachment, because they will get +1 to wound on their twin-linked rocket shots, and for like maximum shooting list of 3 Caladius and a bunch of bikes, I can really see like running this combination with some Alaris, so going in a totally different direction than our normal lists. Well, not totally, but severely different direction. But the bikes, again, they don't benefit from the +1 to wound in combat that much, and that's why, in my opinion, despite it being probably the best detachment to run the bikes in currently, the bikes still are not really worth your attention unless you want to try that really different kind of shooting build. Draxus, we've already talked about that one. Still an amazing unit, amazing ability to make herself an 18-inch lone up, herself and the unit, which gives you the ability to sort of expand onto an objective sometimes when your opponent's army is in one spot of the board, and then your unit just advances slightly up and captures an objective, but is still out of range of the guns because of that lone up ability. Amazing squad, and now it shoots incredibly hard. Prosecutors and Witch Seekers are as good here as they are anywhere. Again, we've already covered that. You want 2 or 3 squads of any combination of these, depending on how points allowed. The Witch Seekers are generally speaking better than the Prosecutors, but the Prosecutors are cheaper. So if you can fit another squad of Prosecutors by making them, making the Witch Seekers into Prosecutors, I think it's worth it. My opinion is Wardens are still an integral part of the army, because they are the only thing that I can actually look into the barrel of a tank or multiple tanks and then come back swinging from that. You cannot really say that about pretty much anything else here, apart from maybe the Caladius tanks, because those guys always win the shootouts with other tanks, but that's like a different type of a unit. The Wardens are the only melee capable actual point scoring unit that can do that. So I still think you need those guys. I don't believe in replacing them completely with LRs and the bikes, because the data sheet problems of the LRs and the bikes are still there, and the LRs are still relatively expensive. Sorry, I feel a bit out of the list here, because their Lance rule really contradicts the whole +1 to wound thing that the detachment allows you to have. So I probably would not recommend to run them. It doesn't make them, doesn't exclude them automatically, because still they're an amazing unit for their cost, but probably puts them in a less relevant spot. And finally, Dreadnoughts are really not something that you want to use in this detachment. If you want to run Dreadnoughts, first, you probably don't want to because of the nerfs that they have received. But if you want to, go and try the detachment for the Dreadnoughts, because that one is still relevant and it's still pretty good. Next are synergies. So finally, we're going to talk about the 3 amazing enhancements that we have in this detachment. We also have a 4th one, but it's not nearly as good. And considering that you can only take 3, there's just no way in hell you're going to take that one instead of one of these. Just, it doesn't happen, so we're not going to cover it. Presidious is an amazing enhancement, and it gives any of your characters lone up and stealth. It can be any of them. It can be a blade champion, though you don't want to run a blade champion as a lone up because, well, you want him to be leading one of your units to give them advance and charge. It's a very cool idea to have the blade champion as a solo like guy who runs out and kills stuff, but yeah, probably not in this edition. And it works really well on Bike Captain because of the speed of the bike and the fact that Bike Captain really wants to work alone sometimes. The size of a model operates better. If it's a single model, it's easier to hide. It's easier to just jump out and charge something and still be outside of range of the guns thanks to Little Knob. And if for some reason you mismeasure or make a mistake, you at least have stealth to protect you somewhat from the shooting. Also works pretty well on the Alaris. I'm not saying it doesn't. I'm just saying that the Alaris captain, because of how slow he is, sometimes you will not get the chance to actually be outside of the potential threat range of the guns, considering your low knob range. That's why, in my opinion, the bike operates better in this sense. And believe me, Alaris captains have much better enhancement to put on them, in my opinion. And this would be Admoni Mortis. It's a majestic buff for your shield captain that gives their melee +3 to the strength, +1 to AP and damage, which essentially turns one of your captains into a legitimate blender for almost anything. And it works really well whether you will go for the axe, which would make it strength 12, AP 2, damage 4. It's a great profile against monsters, some heavier elite infantry and vehicles, obviously. Or you can go for the more general kind of AP strength 10, AP 3, damage 3 profile that is also amazing. I would probably, just because Admoni Mortis in the lore is an axe, I'll probably put it on the axe captain still, and I think the damage 4 really is the thing that makes it so amazing for me, but it's up to you. Both options are pretty good. You really want that guy to have the retinue of Alaris in order for him to have the full rerolls to wound, to make sure that every single attack from that amazing weapon goes onto the save of your opponent. And lastly, Superior Creation gives your character probably an Alaris captain again because of that ability to make all damage 1 for a phase, an ability to stand back up from death on the 2+ with full wounds remaining. And Alaris captains have 7 wounds, so they are really tough to kill just by themselves, and giving them an ability to stand back up from being dead and give them essentially a whole nother activation is amazing. It's very, very big, and it will make sneaking a captain into enemy lines so much more rewarding, because once they start engaging the captain, he'll probably kill some stuff on the fight back. Then they kill the captain. He can use the fight on death ability to fight on 2+, then stand back up, and then again fight. And only then, after everything, he will be able to potentially, he will be brought down. And you can, if you have the CP to fund it, you can even make his make all damage 1 ability activate again, making it so much more difficult to fight against him. Keep in mind as well that he is a captain, so he can make some of that 0 CP. And if you have the same problem as I did, where you like fit Presidius, you fit Admoni Mortis, but the Superior Creation really, like, you cannot put it anywhere else, and you don't have a spare Alaris captain to put it on, you can put it on your Blade Champion in the Warden squad, which is not like the ideal use case. You probably want that on your Alaris captain still, but if you cannot put it in the Alaris captain, on the Blade Champion it still will work. And once the Warden squad is dead, if something kills the Blade Champion, at least he can survive and then fight another phase against something. Let's lastly look at the roster example that I've built. This is just a basic example. You can do better than this one, but this is something that I would be comfortable with playing in a tournament setting. So it's Alliance of the Emperor Detachment. We have a Blade Champion with the Superior Creation enhancement, just as I described in a moment ago. He's leading a 5-man squad of Wardens. We have a Shield Captain in Lars Terminator armor with Presidius, and he is going alone because he's utilizing that ability, lone up ability. He'll be deep striking or rapid ingressing, depending on how the game goes. We have a Shield Captain Lars Terminator armor who is leading a 2-man squad of Alaris with Admoni Mortis. We have a 4-man squad of Custodian Guard led by, of course, Inquisitor Draxus. We have 3 Caladius Graph Tanks. We have another squad of 4 Wardens and a squad of 4 Witch Seekers to guard our home objective. So not a lot of units. As you can see, the points are really tight in this current build, but I think it's still a pretty powerful powerful one, and I would love to hear what you think about this one in the comment section below. Let me know what you think about the new lines of the Emperor Detachment. I'm really interested in whether you had experience playing it already at your local club or your games at home, and what you think about this one. Do you agree that this is the most powerful detachment, or do you still like Talons of the Emperor or perhaps Shield Host? I would love to hear that in the comment section. Thank you so much, and I'll see you next time.